kingdom of Heart. Far beyond the nearest town, where the road dwindled to a dusty path and the great green forest began in earnest, an elderly couple tended a modest farm. The land yielded just enough for them to manage: a humble plot of earth, a pair of goats, and a battered wooden barn that creaked in the nighttime breeze. Yet amid these meager belongings, the couple had once found a curious bundle at their threshold: a baby boy wrapped in threadbare cloth, no name stitched on any scrap of fabric, no letter to explain his heritage. The only thing distinctive about him was his bright gaze and the undeniable warmth of his spirit. They took him in, calling him simply Heart. Though his origins were unknown, his presence filled their home with cheer. In the years that followed, Heart proved an able helper on the farm. He rose at first light to feed the goats and water the patch of vegetables that fed the household. Day by day, he grew tall and strong. Yet despite the routine of chores and the contented hush of country life, the boy was given to dreaming. Even when he was small, he would sneak away to the far edge of the forest. There, by the gentle river running beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, he would imagine himself a mighty knight. He lifted makeshift sticks as swords, carved his courage into the quiet air, and pretended to lead glorious battles for justice and honor. The old woman, who had raised him from infancy, grew anxious whenever he strayed too far. "Mind me, lad," she would say, shaking her head in gentle reproof. "We know not what lurks beneath those tall trees. Could be a wandering king or a crafty villain, or, by the forest's own mystery, perhaps both at once." Heart would often grin, daring to joke, "Then I shall treat them each with respect and bravery." But the woman's worried frown was warning enough, and Heart usually returned before dusk, arms laden with kindling and his thoughts full of the day's fantasies. One golden summer afternoon, however, the sun's warmth lulled him into a doze by the riverside. The chirping of birds and the gentle gurgle of the water soothed him until his eyelids closed. By the time Heart stirred from sleep, dusk had settled. Although the fading light cast long, eerie shadows, he felt neither alarm nor confusion. He knew every bend in the river, every twisted root beneath the towering oaks. Confidently, he rose and began to make his way home. Just then, movement on the opposite bank caught his eye: a dark figure, a woman draped in a shimmering blue aura that seemed both moonlit and iridescent at once. Her beauty was without compare, though her features were partly hidden by the dusk. Heart, guided by the boldness in his young heart, called across to her, "Are you lost, my lady?" At the sound of his voice, she turned her face toward him. Even in the gathering darkness, he felt the weight of her gaze, like starlight pressing against his very soul. "Do not speak to travelers," she said in a voice gentle as night's first breeze. Then, with a soft swirl of her trailing garments, she slipped away into the forest shadows, leaving Heart standing there, stunned and brimming with questions. He hurried home, deciding at once that he would return the following night to see what other secrets the forest might reveal once the sun had dipped below the horizon. True to his promise to himself, Heart ventured out the next evening. He settled at his familiar spot by the river, a hush falling over the woods as twilight deepened. For a long while, nothing stirred except the water and the sigh of wind among the leaves. Eventually, the day's labors wore on him, and he drifted into a light sleep. When he awakened, he glimpsed an old man on the bank, his back stooped, his hands working clumsily with a fishing line. Even more curious, the man wore a broad strip of cloth wrapped around his eyes, as though he were blind. He struggled to thread the hook with bait in the faint moonlight, grumbling softly at the tangles in the line. Heart, whose kindness often ran ahead of caution, came to his side. Without a word, the boy took up the man's line and deftly slid a bit of bait onto the hook. The old man nodded and in a hushed tone thanked him. But as Heart turned to gather his things, the fisherman suddenly spoke again. "Do not take their gifts." A quaver of age ran through his words, yet something in his voice carried authority beyond measure. Then he grew silent as stone. Unsure how to respond, Heart left the man to his night fishing and returned home under the watchful stars. By the third night, curiosity had become a gentle but unbreakable chain upon Heart's spirit. He once again crept out of the farm after sunset. The path to the river was by now second nature, and he arrived at his resting place without incident. Hours passed quietly, But it was in these small hours that the forest's hidden magic stirred. At the stroke of midnight, or maybe a bit past, Hart awoke to a distant melody. Following the lilting notes, he saw a procession on the far side of the river. Lanterns glowed softly in the dark, illuminating a caravan of figures so beautiful and tall that they scarcely seemed mortal. They were elves, or so Hart guessed, with long, graceful limbs and hair that shimmered like molten gold. They danced and sang as they walked, and their music beckoned him with an enchantment older than any mortal kingdom. One in particular, with a voice like a harp's gentle chord, stepped forward and asked his name. Hart nearly answered, but in the instant he opened his mouth, the goddess-like woman's warning flickered in his memory. "Do not speak to travelers." So he shut his lips and remained silent. The elf who had addressed him then extended a pearlescent hand, offering a chain of delicate gold. Another elf brought forth rich cloth, embroidered with threads like spun moonlight. Yet a third set down a small chest that Hart imagined might hold jewels of impossible worth. Gifts upon gifts were laid at Hart's feet. And yet he recalled the old fisherman's trembling warning, "Do not take their gifts." Summoning all his resolve, he refused them, simply remaining still and accepting nothing. As time wore on, the elves seemed more puzzled than angered. Finally, they gathered up the brilliant objects, leaving Hart unburdened by their enchantments. One by one, the dancers resumed their journey, their echoes fading into the forest gloom. All that remained was the memory of their exquisite voices on the hush of the wind. But just when the darkness seemed complete, a single figure returned. This one was older, with silver in his hair, and an air of quiet authority in his ageless eyes. Wordlessly, he placed a folded piece of parchment before Hart, then vanished with the last strains of the caravan's music. The forest was still once more. At first light, heart pounding, Hart dared to glance at the object left behind. It was a page of such fine texture that it might have been woven from starlight, with swirling lines of ink that danced over its surface. He would have been tempted to pick it up at once, but the fisherman's caution still echoed in his mind. Instead, he ran home to share everything with his foster mother. She listened in silence until he had told all, the woman glowing with a blue aura, the blind fisherman, and the mysterious caravan of elves. Slowly, the lines in her face seemed to deepen. The first, she explained, was the goddess of night, keeper of secrets that dwell in darkness. The second was the Fisher King, ancient and wise in hidden lore. And the caravan you saw were elves of the wandering realm. When they tempt a mortal with gifts, if he speaks or lays hand upon their treasures, it is said he loses his senses. But if he resists and stays steadfast until dawn, they leave behind one final item, a key to one's most hidden desire. A hush fell over the farmhouse kitchen. Hart's breath caught in his throat. Was that folded page truly the answer to his deepest longing? The old woman's voice was gentle as she laid a hand on his arm. "Go, child. Find what you truly seek." Returning to the riverbank, Hart found the parchment where it had been placed, warmed by the rising sun. With a trembling hand he picked it up and, unfolding it, beheld a map illustrated in sumptuous color. Here, the arch of a mountain peak; there, the shining path of a river. At its pinnacle, scrawled in brilliant script, stood the words, "The way to the kingdom of Hart." A stirring like lightning coursed through him. Though he knew not what land it pointed to nor what castle it promised, Hart understood in the marrow of his bones that this map might reveal who he was meant to be. Perhaps it would tell him the story of his lost family, or show him a grand destiny beyond the farm and forest. It might grant him the knighthood he had dreamed of all his life, honor and purpose more dazzling than the morning sun. He ran back home, bursting through the door with the map trembling in his hands. His foster father regarded it with a keen eye, then held Hart's shoulder. "Lad, be sure of what you seek. Follow that path only if you truly wish to discover your heritage and your future." The old woman smiled, though tears rimmed her eyes. "Remember," she whispered, "whatever you find beyond these fields, you shall remain our boy, our Hart, whose courage has always been matched only by his kindness." And so, with a small pack of food and water, and carrying the wondrous map tucked close against his chest, Hart set off at dawn. The elders stood at the edge of the farm, watching him disappear into the winding road, leading deeper than he had ever traveled before. Around him stretched rolling hills, quiet woodlands, and the uncertain horizon. But in his hand glowed the chart that promised a realm named after himself, perhaps a kingdom only he could claim. Hart had walked through moonlit visions without succumbing to fear or temptation, and it was that steadfast spirit which would guide him now toward the hidden kingdom that bore his name, a land whose gates perhaps open only for those resolute enough to heed the forest's warnings and generous enough to aid its ancient wanderers.